December 1944. The war in Europe had reached what many believed to be its final chapter. Allied forces, buoyed by their successful invasion of Normandy 6 months earlier, had pushed deep into German-held territory. Paris had been liberated. The Rhine River, Germany's last natural barrier, seemed within reach. American, British, and Canadian troops were advancing on a broad front, and there was talk in some quarters that the war might be over by Christmas. But Adolf Hitler had other plans. In the densely forested Ardennes region of Belgium and Luxembourg, where the borders of three nations converged in a landscape of steep valleys and narrow roads, the German dictator was preparing one final, desperate gamble. He would launch a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes, just as Germany had done in 1940, catching the Allies completely by surprise. The goal was audacious: split the Allied armies in two, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force the Western powers to negotiate a separate peace. The offensive would come to be known as the Battle of the Bulge, the largest and bloodiest battle fought by American forces in World War II. But within this massive clash of armies, numbering over 1 million men, there existed a smaller, stranger operation, one that would sow fear and paranoia throughout the American ranks and demonstrate just how thin the line between friend and foe could become. This is the story of Operation Greif, the mission that sent German commandos, dressed in American uniforms and speaking fluent English, behind enemy lines to create chaos in the heart of the Allied war machine. It is a story of deception, improvisation, and the power of fear to accomplish what bullets and bombs could not. The architect of this audacious plan was one of Nazi Germany's most celebrated special operations officers, SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny. At 6 feet 4 inches tall, with a distinctive dueling scar running down his left cheek, Skorzeny looked every inch the Hollywood version of a Nazi commando. But he was far more than a propaganda poster. By December 1944, he had already earned a legendary reputation within the German military establishment for a series of daring operations that seemed to belong more to the realm of adventure fiction than to the grinding reality of total war. Skorzeny had first come to Hitler's attention in September 1933 when he led the mission to rescue Italian dictator Benito Mussolini from his mountain prison at Gran Sasso. Using gliders to land commandos on a tiny plateau high in the Apennines, Skorzeny had snatched Mussolini from under the noses of his Italian guards without firing a shot. The operation made headlines around the world and turned Skorzeny into the Reich's most famous special operations commander. Hitler personally decorated him and began to see in this Austrian soldier a man who could accomplish the impossible. In October 1944, Skorzeny led another successful operation, kidnapping the son of Hungarian regent Miklos Horthy and preventing Hungary from signing an armistice with the Soviet Union. Once again, boldness and deception had won the day. So when Hitler began planning his Ardennes offensive, he turned to Skorzeny to execute what would be the most unconventional element of the entire campaign. The plan that emerged was both simple in concept and extraordinarily complex in execution. Skorzeny would assemble a special unit of English-speaking German soldiers, equip them with captured American uniforms, weapons, and vehicles, and send them behind enemy lines during the opening hours of the offensive. These men would spread confusion, cut communications lines, change road signs, give false orders, and generally create havoc in the American rear areas. If everything went according to plan, they would paralyze American decision-making at the crucial moment when speed and coordination were essential. But Skorzeny's mission went beyond mere tactical advantage.
Hitler and his planners understood that modern warfare was as much a psychological contest as a physical one. They wanted to create an atmosphere of paranoia and mistrust within the American forces, where no one could be certain who was really on their side. In an army where trust and cohesion were essential, the mere possibility that the man next to you might be a German infiltrator could be as disruptive as an artillery barrage. The operation was given the code name Greif, the German word for griffin, the mythological creature that was part eagle and part lion, a fitting symbol for an operation that combined cunning with ferocity. Skorzeny threw himself into the preparations with characteristic energy. But from the beginning, he faced enormous obstacles. The first challenge was finding suitable personnel. The operation required German soldiers who could speak English fluently, with American accents if possible, and who had enough familiarity with American culture to pass as authentic GIs under questioning. This was a tall order in an army that had been fighting for 5 years and had suffered millions of casualties. Skorzeny put out a call throughout the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS for men with the necessary language skills, but the response was disappointing. Out of nearly 2,000 volunteers who eventually reported for training, only about 10 could speak English with anything approaching an authentic American accent. Most of the volunteers had learned their English in school or from books, giving them what one American officer later described as textbook English that sounded nothing like the casual, slang-filled speech of actual American soldiers. Some had lived or worked in the United States before the war and spoke with regional accents that might betray them if they claimed to be from a different part of the country. Others could barely string together a coherent sentence in English, but had volunteered anyway, either out of misguided enthusiasm or because they had been pressured by their commanders.
Skorzeny's training camp, established at Grafenwohr in Bavaria, became a crash course in all things American. The volunteers watched American films, studied captured American newspapers and magazines, and practiced mimicking American behavior and mannerisms. They learned to smoke American cigarettes in the American style, to shuffle cards the American way, to wear their uniforms with the casual informality that marked American soldiers. They memorized the ranks and insignia of the U.S. Army, studied American slang, and drilled on the organizational structure of American units. The training regimen was intense and often frustrating. German instructors, many of whom had lived in America before the war, worked with the volunteers to eliminate telltale Germanic habits and mannerisms. They taught them to walk with the loose, casual gait of American soldiers, rather than the stiff, precise march of the Wehrmacht. They drilled them on American military protocol, which was considerably more relaxed than German standards. American soldiers, the instructors explained, did not snap to attention with the same rigidity as German soldiers. They addressed their officers with less formality. They carried their weapons differently, often slung casually over a shoulder, rather than held at precise angles. The cultural training extended to eating habits and social behavior. The Commandos learned to chew gum constantly, as American soldiers seemed to do. They practiced the American habit of keeping hands in pockets, something that would have been considered slovenly in the German military. They learned American card games and practiced telling jokes in English with American timing and delivery. They studied photographs of American soldiers to understand how uniforms were worn, slightly unbuttoned, often without ties, with caps worn at jaunty angles rather than precisely positioned. Language instruction proved to be the most challenging aspect of the training. The instructors emphasized that speaking grammatically correct English was not enough. The Commandos needed to sound like real Americans, with all the casual slang, regional expressions, and verbal shortcuts that characterized actual American speech. They drilled on contractions, which German speakers often avoided. They practiced using the passive voice and indirect constructions that came naturally to American English speakers. They memorized lists of American slang terms and practiced using them in natural-sounding contexts. But despite all this training, most of the volunteers remained unconvincing. Their accents betrayed them, or their word choices sounded too formal,
or they made small grammatical errors that no native speaker would make. Some developed nervous habits when speaking English, clearing their throats, pausing too long before responding, speaking too carefully and precisely. These were exactly the sorts of tells that would give them away to a suspicious American interrogator. The instructors emphasized that authenticity lay in the details. An American soldier, they explained, carried his rifle differently than a German soldier. He walked with a different gait. He smoked differently, ate differently, even stood differently when waiting in line. The German commandos had to unlearn years of military training and adopt an entirely new set of physical habits. For men who had spent years in the rigid, hierarchical world of the German military, this proved surprisingly difficult. But the linguistic and cultural challenges were only part of the problem. Skorzeny also needed American equipment, uniforms, weapons, vehicles, and all the countless small items that would make his men look like genuine American soldiers. This requirement pushed the German supply system to its limits. Procurement teams scoured prisoner of war camps, supply depots, and battlefields, gathering anything that bore American markings. The collection that resulted was a bizarre hodgepodge. There were American jeeps and trucks, some captured intact, others cobbled together from salvaged parts. There were American uniforms in various sizes and conditions, many of them blood-stained or torn from their previous owners. There were American weapons, M1 Garand rifles, Thompson submachine guns, Colt pistols, most of them taken from dead or captured American soldiers. There were cigarettes, chocolate bars, chewing gum, and other small items that German intelligence believed were essential to maintaining the illusion. But there was never enough. Skorzeny had hoped to equip an entire armored brigade with captured American tanks and self-propelled guns, which could then spearhead the German advance while wearing American markings. This ambitious goal proved impossible. The Germans managed to collect only a handful of American armored vehicles, most in poor condition. Instead, Skorzeny's people resorted to a deception that would have been comical if the stakes had not been so high. They disguised German tanks to look like American ones. Panther tanks, one of Germany's most formidable armored vehicles, were given crude sheet metal modifications to alter their silhouettes. Paint and American markings completed the disguise. To anyone who knew what they were looking for, the deception was obvious. The Panthers were significantly larger than any American tank, and their distinctive shape could not be completely hidden by cosmetic modifications. But in the confusion of battle, at night or in poor weather, Skorzeny hoped the disguises might buy his men a few crucial seconds or minutes of confusion. The vehicle modifications revealed both the ambition and the desperation of the German effort. Workshops worked around the clock to transform German vehicles into passable imitations of American ones. Sheet metal workers fabricated false panels to change the angular lines of German trucks into the more rounded contours of American models. Painters mixed special colors to match the distinctive olive drab of American military vehicles, a shade that was subtly different from German field gray. Mechanics studied American vehicles to understand their mechanical quirks and characteristics so that German drivers could operate the captured equipment convincingly. But these efforts could only go so far. The sound of engines remained distinctively different. American vehicles had a different mechanical rhythm than German ones, a difference that experienced soldiers could detect even at a distance. The way vehicles handled on rough terrain differed. Even the smell was different. American gasoline and oil had distinctive odors that differed from their German equivalents. These subtle sensory clues could betray a disguised vehicle to anyone paying close attention. The weapons procurement presented similar challenges. While the Germans had captured substantial quantities of American small arms, heavier weapons were scarce. The operation required not just rifles and pistols, but also machine guns, mortars, bazookas, and all the other equipment that American units would normally carry. Some of these weapons were in short supply even in the American army, making them nearly impossible for the Germans to obtain in sufficient quantities. Skorzeny's procurement team scoured every possible source, even negotiating with black market dealers in neutral countries, but the shortages persisted. The procurement effort extended to the smallest details. German intelligence had noted that American soldiers carried a bewildering variety of personal items: playing cards, photographs, letters from home, religious medals, good luck charms. To be convincing, the German commandos needed to carry similar items, so the procurement teams gathered these personal effects from prisoners and casualties, creating an inventory that was both impressive and macabre. Each commando would carry not just an American uniform and weapons, but a pocket full of small details designed to withstand casual inspection.
As the equipment came together, Skorzeny refined his operational plan. He divided his force into 3 types of units, each with different missions. The first type consisted of small teams, usually 3 or 4 men in a jeep, who would slip through the lines in the chaos of the initial attack. These teams would penetrate deep into American-held territory, where they would spread confusion through a variety of methods, changing road signs to misdirect American units, cutting telephone lines, spreading false rumors, and generally creating the impression that German forces were much closer than they actually were. The second type of unit was larger, roughly a company in strength, and would be integrated into the regular German assault forces. These units, wearing German uniforms but carrying American weapons and equipment, would fight alongside conventional German troops. Once they had penetrated American lines, they would change into American uniforms and proceed with sabotage and reconnaissance missions. The third and most ambitious element was the false flag armored brigade, which would use the disguised tanks and vehicles to attack American positions while wearing American markings. This unit, Skorzeny hoped, would create maximum confusion and might even convince some American units that they were being attacked by their own forces. But as the date of the offensive approached, Skorzeny's preparations were plagued with problems. Security for the operation had been extremely tight. Hitler had personally emphasized that any breach could doom the entire offensive. But rumors were spreading throughout the Wehrmacht. Stories circulated about strange units training to speak English, about collections of American equipment, about a secret mission behind enemy lines. Some of these rumors reached absurd proportions. One version claimed that Skorzeny's mission was to drive all the way to Paris and assassinate General Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander. Skorzeny himself was exasperated by such talk. His actual mission, while certainly audacious, was much more modest. He would create confusion and fear, disrupt communications, and generally make the American response to the German offensive as slow and disorganized as possible. If his men could delay American reinforcements by even a few hours, they would have accomplished something valuable. Anything beyond that would be a bonus. There was also the troubling question of legality. According to the laws of war, soldiers were permitted to use enemy uniforms for purposes of deception, but they were required to remove or cover those uniforms before engaging in combat. Fighting while wearing enemy uniforms was considered a war crime, and those caught doing so could be executed as spies rather than treated as prisoners of war. Skorzeny was well aware of this legal distinction, and he briefed his men accordingly. They were to remove any outer garments before engaging in combat, revealing their German uniforms underneath. But Skorzeny knew that in the chaos and violence of battle, such niceties might be impossible to observe. And he knew that if his men were captured while wearing American uniforms, regardless of whether they had fired any shots, they would likely face a firing squad. He did not dwell on this reality, but it was understood by everyone involved. The men of Operation Greif were volunteers, but they were also, in a sense, walking dead men from the moment they put on their American uniforms. On December 16, 1944, at 5:30 in the morning, the German offensive began. More than 200,000 German soldiers, supported by nearly 1,000 tanks and assault guns, attacked along an 85-mile front in the Ardennes. The offensive caught the Americans completely by surprise. The Ardennes had been considered a quiet sector, held by inexperienced units or divisions resting after heavy fighting elsewhere. The American commanders, from Eisenhower down to company-level officers, had been confident that the Germans were incapable of launching a major offensive. They were wrong. In the first hours of the attack, German artillery pounded American positions with devastating effect.
Then came the infantry and armor, driving forward through the snow and fog, overwhelming the shocked American defenders. Communications broke down. Units lost contact with their headquarters. The carefully organized American defense disintegrated into chaos. And into this chaos slipped the first teams from Operation Greif. The infiltration teams crossed into American-held territory using a variety of methods. Some simply drove through gaps in the American lines, their jeeps and American uniforms allowing them to pass unchallenged in the confusion. Others followed closely behind advancing German units, then peeled off once they were in the American rear area. A few teams were inserted by more sophisticated means, with carefully forged documents and cover stories designed to explain their presence. Once behind American lines, the teams set to work. They changed road signs, reversing the arrows that pointed to important crossroads and towns. They cut telephone and telegraph lines, severing communications between American headquarters and frontline units. They mingled with streams of refugees and retreating soldiers, spreading rumors that German paratroopers had landed in the American rear area, that entire American divisions had been destroyed, that German armored columns were already approaching the Meuse River. The tactics employed by the infiltration teams varied depending on their specific missions and the opportunities that presented themselves. Some teams focused on pure sabotage, cutting communication lines, mining roads, destroying fuel dumps. These activities required technical skill and nerve, as the commandos had to work quickly while remaining alert for American patrols or suspicious observers. One team managed to plant explosives at a key ammunition depot, though the charges were discovered and defused before they could detonate. Another team successfully destroyed a telephone relay station, disrupting communications for several crucial hours. Other teams concentrated on spreading disinformation and confusion. They would approach American units claiming to have information about German positions or movements, then provide false intelligence designed to send American forces in the wrong direction or convince them that threats existed where none were present. One particularly effective team convinced an American military police unit that German paratroopers had landed near a critical road junction. The MPs redirected traffic away from the junction for several hours while they searched for the non-existent paratroopers, creating exactly the kind of delay and confusion that Skorzeny had hoped to achieve.
Still other teams attempted more ambitious operations. One group tried to capture an American general's staff car, planning to use it to gain access to headquarters facilities. The attempt failed when the general's driver became suspicious of the commandos' accents and refused to stop. Another team planned to seize control of a bridge over the Meuse River by approaching American guards in their disguised vehicles and overwhelming them before they could react. This plan also failed when American sentries, already on high alert for infiltrators, challenged the approaching vehicles from a safe distance and opened fire when the responses seemed suspicious. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. American military police, tasked with directing traffic and maintaining order, suddenly found themselves unable to trust anyone. The jeep that had just driven past, was it really carrying American soldiers, or were they Germans in disguise? The captain asking for directions, was he who he claimed to be, or an infiltrator? The report that German tanks had been spotted in a particular area, was it accurate, or disinformation spread by enemy agents? As word of the infiltrator spread, American commanders began implementing security measures. Military police set up checkpoints on roads throughout the rear area. Any soldier or officer who approached was subjected to questioning designed to verify their identity. But how do you prove you are an American? Military ID cards could be forged. Uniforms could be stolen. The Germans had surely briefed their infiltrators on American military organization and procedures. So the military police began asking questions about American culture. Questions that any real American would know, but that a German imposter might stumble over. What are the names of the baseball teams? Who won the World Series? What is the capital of Illinois? Who is Mickey Mouse's girlfriend? Name the three Marx brothers. Who was married to Betty Grable? Recite the words to the national anthem. This system, improvised in haste and desperation, was deeply flawed. American soldiers came from every part of the country and every walk of life. A farm boy from rural Montana might not know who won the World Series. An intellectual from New England might not care about Hollywood gossip. Regional differences in knowledge and accent could look suspicious to a nervous military policeman. And the questions themselves quickly became known throughout the army, meaning that a clever German infiltrator who had been captured and interrogated might pass along the questions to other teams. The irony was that some American soldiers failed these impromptu tests of Americanness, while some of the better prepared German infiltrators passed them. One American lieutenant stopped at a checkpoint and asked to name the capital of a particular state, gave the wrong answer, and spent several hours detained before his identity was confirmed. Meanwhile, at least one German team successfully navigated a checkpoint by correctly answering questions about American popular culture, only to be caught later when their accents gave them away during a more extended conversation. The checkpoint system created its own peculiar absurdities. At one location, military police asked every passing soldier to identify the position of the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor. The problem was that many American soldiers had never been to New York and had no idea whether the statue was on the east side, west side, or in the middle of the harbor. One frustrated sergeant from Kansas finally exploded at the military policeman questioning him, demanding to know why his ignorance of New York geography made him a suspected German spy. The incident highlighted the fundamental problem with using cultural knowledge as a security measure. American culture was vast and diverse, and no single American could be expected to know everything about it. The questions also revealed interesting patterns about what Americans in 1944 considered essential knowledge. Baseball dominated many of the security questions, reflecting the sport's central place in American culture at the time. Soldiers were asked to name the teams in the American and National Leagues, to identify famous players, to recall World Series results. Hollywood and popular entertainment also featured prominently. Who was married to whom among the movie stars? What were the names of popular radio programs? Who were the stars of particular films? These questions reflected an America where mass media and shared popular culture created common reference points across a geographically vast and culturally diverse nation. Despite these flaws, the security checks did catch some infiltrators. The first confirmed capture came on December 17th, when a team of Germans in an American Jeep was stopped at a checkpoint near Iwil. Their English was good, but not quite good enough. One of them hesitated when asked about American baseball teams. The military police, already on high alert for infiltrators, detained the group for further questioning. Under interrogation, the Germans admitted their identities. They were found to be carrying American uniforms, weapons, and a collection of demolition equipment. They had been tasked with blowing up a bridge over the Ambly River. The three men were quickly tried by a military court, found guilty of espionage, and sentenced to death. On December 23rd, they were executed by firing squad, the first of several groups of captured Greif commandos who would face this fate. But the captures, rather than reducing the paranoia, actually intensified it. Now there was proof that German infiltrators were operating behind American lines. The rumors grew wilder. Reports came in of German soldiers dressed as American military police, directing traffic into ambushes, of infiltrators poisoning water supplies, of German assassins hunting for high-ranking American officers. The most persistent rumor claimed that Skorzeny himself was leading a team tasked with assassinating General Eisenhower at his headquarters in Paris. This last rumor was entirely false. Skorzeny was commanding his units from a headquarters near the front lines and had no intention of going anywhere near Paris. But it was taken seriously at the highest levels of the Allied command. Eisenhower's security detail was reinforced. His movements were restricted. He was essentially confined to his headquarters compound, surrounded by guards who checked the papers of anyone who came near. The Supreme Allied Commander, one of the most powerful men in the world, had become a prisoner in his own headquarters because of a rumor started by a handful of German commandos. Other senior officers were subjected to similar security measures. General Omar Bradley, commander of the 12th Army Group, was stopped at a checkpoint and questioned. He was asked to identify the capital of Illinois. Bradley correctly answered Springfield, but the military policeman thought the answer was Chicago and detained the general for half an hour before the matter was straightened out. Bradley later joked about the incident, but it illustrated just how thoroughly the fear of infiltrators had penetrated the American command structure. British Field Marshal Montgomery, never one to pass up an opportunity to criticize their American allies, was also stopped and questioned. According to one probably apocryphal story, when asked to prove he was British, Montgomery pulled rank and told the military policeman, "I am Field Marshal Montgomery. I don't have to answer your questions." The military policeman, unimpressed, replied, "That's what they all say," and detained the field marshal until his identity could be confirmed.
The paranoia extended to ordinary soldiers as well. Men who had fought side by side for months suddenly eyed each other with suspicion. Accents that had previously gone unnoticed now seemed suspicious. Soldiers who asked too many questions about unit dispositions or defensive positions were reported to military intelligence. The atmosphere in many units became poisonous, with trust replaced by constant vigilance and suspicion. Some units developed their own methods for identifying infiltrators. Passwords were changed multiple times per day. Soldiers were required to know not just the password, but also specific details about their unit's recent movements and casualties, information that a German infiltrator would not have. Some units assigned each soldier a buddy who would vouch for their identity, creating a system of mutual surveillance that, while effective, also created an atmosphere of mutual distrust. The impact on unit cohesion was significant and sometimes tragic. In at least one documented case, an American soldier was shot by his own comrades because his accent sounded suspicious and he could not answer their questions to their satisfaction. He was not a German infiltrator. He was an Italian-American from Brooklyn whose accent had never been a problem until the paranoia of December 1944 made every unusual speech pattern a potential sign of enemy infiltration. Such incidents were relatively rare, but they contributed to the atmosphere of fear that pervaded American units throughout the battle. The fear also affected behavior in more subtle ways. Soldiers became reluctant to move at night, when identifying friend from foe was most difficult. Units that would normally have sent out patrols or reconnaissance teams hesitated, worried that their own men might be shot by nervous sentries who assumed anyone moving in the darkness was a German infiltrator. This defensive mentality, while understandable, played into German hands by making American forces less aggressive and less likely to gather the intelligence they desperately needed about German dispositions and intentions. The truth is that most of Operation Greif's infiltration teams accomplished very little in concrete military terms. They changed some road signs, cut some telephone lines, and spread some rumors. They did not capture any bridges. They did not assassinate any generals. They did not significantly disrupt the flow of American reinforcements to the threatened sector. Many teams never even made it through the American lines. Some were caught almost immediately. Others became disoriented and spent days hiding in the Ardennes forests before being captured or killed. The disguised Panthers were spotted and identified almost immediately by American soldiers who knew what a Sherman tank was supposed to look like. Several were destroyed in combat. Others were abandoned when their fuel ran out. The German offensive was plagued by fuel shortages, and Skorzeny's units had low priority for gasoline supplies. The grand scheme of using American markings to confuse American defenders simply did not work. But in terms of psychological impact, Operation Greif was extraordinarily successful. The operation created an atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia that lasted for weeks and spread far beyond the actual battle zone. Soldiers and officers throughout the European theater suddenly became aware that the enemy might be anywhere, wearing any uniform. Trust, the essential element that holds any army together, was damaged in ways that were difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. The impact on decision-making was particularly significant. American commanders, already struggling to understand what was happening in the confused fighting, now had to contend with the possibility that their information was being deliberately manipulated by enemy agents. Reports had to be double-checked and verified. Orders had to be confirmed through multiple channels. Messengers had to be questioned before their messages could be trusted. All of this took time, precious time that could have been used to coordinate counterattacks and move reinforcements. Historians have debated how much Operation Greif actually contributed to the initial German success in the Ardennes. The offensive was already achieving surprise and making rapid progress before the infiltrators' activities had much impact. The American forces were caught off guard by the scale and location of the German attack, not by the actions of a few dozen men in American uniforms. But it is also true that the confusion and paranoia created by Operation Greif made the American response slower and less coordinated than it might otherwise have been. The delay was measurable in hours rather than days, but in the fluid situation of December 1944, even a few hours mattered enormously. Reinforcements that might have arrived on December 17th arrived on December 18th instead. Artillery batteries that might have been positioned to cover a critical crossroads spent valuable time verifying orders and identities before moving forward. Tank destroyers that should have been rushed forward to stop German armor were held back while their commanders waited for confirmation that the reports they were receiving were genuine. In some cases, the delays had concrete tactical consequences. At Malmedy, where one of the battle's most infamous incidents occurred, American reinforcements were delayed by checkpoint procedures, arriving too late to prevent a massacre of American prisoners by Waffen-SS troops. At Bastogne, which would become famous for its heroic defense, American commanders spent precious hours in the early stages of the battle trying to sort out conflicting reports and verify information, time that might have been used to strengthen the defensive perimeter or evacuate non-essential personnel.
The psychological warfare aspect of Operation Greif also extended beyond the immediate battle zone. News of the infiltrators spread quickly through the Allied rear areas, carried by soldiers rotating back from the front and by the military rumor mill that operated with remarkable efficiency. Soon, soldiers hundreds of miles from the Ardennes were hearing stories about German commandos in American uniforms. The stories grew more elaborate and frightening with each retelling. In some versions, the infiltrators were superbly trained English speakers who could pass as Native Americans. In others, they were ruthless assassins hunting for specific targets. In still others, they were saboteurs equipped with sophisticated explosives and poisons. The stories reached civilian populations as well, particularly in France and Belgium, where the battle was taking place. Civilians who had already endured years of German occupation now faced the terrifying possibility that German soldiers might be hiding among the Allied forces that had liberated them. This fear was exploited by some individuals for personal gain or revenge. In several documented cases, civilians used accusations of being German infiltrators to settle old scores or eliminate rivals, claiming that their enemies were secretly German commandos. The resulting investigations wasted time and resources while adding to the general atmosphere of paranoia and suspicion. By late December, the German offensive was running out of steam. American reinforcements were arriving in strength. The weather cleared, allowing American air power to devastate German armored columns. The German spearheads were stopped short of the Meuse River, their ultimate objective. The Bulge they had created in the American lines, the source of the battle's popular name, was being compressed and eliminated. By January 1945, the Germans were in retreat, having accomplished nothing except the sacrifice of men and equipment they could not afford to lose.
The remnants of Operation Greif withdrew with the rest of the German forces. Most of the infiltration teams had been captured or killed. Those who made it back to German lines brought with them stories of close calls and narrow escapes, but little else. Skorzeny himself was disappointed with the results. He had hoped for something more dramatic, some decisive action that would justify the enormous effort that had gone into the operation. Instead, his commandos had mostly succeeded in creating fear and confusion, valuable in its way, but not the stuff of legend. In the following weeks and months, as the Battle of the Bulge became history and the Allied armies pushed deeper into Germany, the story of Operation Greif gradually faded from public awareness. It was overshadowed by the larger story of the battle, the heroic defense of Bastogne, the armored battles around Saint-Vit, the terrible casualties on both sides. The infiltrators became a footnote, a curious detail in a much larger narrative. But for those who had experienced the paranoia and suspicion firsthand, Operation Greif left a lasting impression. Years later, veterans would still remember the strange days when they could not trust their own uniforms, when every encounter with another soldier carried the possibility of danger, when the certainty of knowing who was friend and who was foe suddenly vanished. The captured infiltrators who survived the war told their stories during interrogations and later in memoirs and interviews. They described the terror of operating behind enemy lines, knowing that capture meant almost certain execution. They spoke of the strange experience of wearing American uniforms and speaking English, feeling like actors in a deadly play. Some expressed regret for their actions. Others remained defiant, insisting they had simply followed orders and done their duty. One captured commando, interviewed years after the war, described the moment he realized his mission was doomed. His team had successfully passed through American lines and was driving toward their objective when they encountered a group of American soldiers at a crossroads. The Americans waved them through without question, but as the jeep passed, one of the German commandos made a small mistake. He shifted gears in a way that no American driver would have done. One of the American soldiers noticed, shouted a warning, and suddenly the German team was under fire. They escaped that encounter, but the close call shattered their confidence. They spent the next 3 days hiding in the forest before finally being captured by an American patrol. Another infiltrator described the bizarre experience of speaking English and wearing American uniforms while surrounded by American soldiers. He recalled stopping at an American supply depot to ask for directions and having a friendly conversation with an American sergeant who offered him coffee and a cigarette. The German commando accepted both, maintaining his American persona while internally terrified that he would make some small mistake that would give him away. The sergeant talked about his family back home in Ohio, complained about the cold weather, and wished aloud that the war would end soon so he could go home. The German, who had a wife and children in Bavaria and wanted nothing more than to survive the war, found himself nodding in agreement, feeling a strange kinship with this enemy soldier who wanted exactly the same things he did. When he finally drove away, he felt relief, mixed with an odd sense of guilt for having deceived someone who had shown him such casual kindness. These personal accounts reveal the human dimension of Operation Greif that often gets lost in the tactical analysis. The German commandos were not faceless infiltrators or propaganda caricatures. They were soldiers caught in an impossible situation, wearing enemy uniforms deep behind enemy lines, knowing that capture meant almost certain execution. Many of them had volunteered for the mission out of a sense of duty or adventure, but found the reality far different from what they had imagined. They discovered that maintaining a false identity under constant stress was exhausting and terrifying, that every encounter with American soldiers was a potential death sentence, and that the line between courage and foolhardiness was thinner than they had thought. Otto Skorzeny himself survived the war and faced trial for war crimes, specifically for ordering his men to fight in American uniforms. The trial was a strange affair. Skorzeny argued that he had explicitly ordered his men not to engage in combat while wearing American uniforms, and that the operation had been designed to stay within the laws of war.
Several witnesses, including some Americans, testified that the operation, while certainly unorthodox, had not technically violated the laws of war as they existed at the time. The prosecution struggled to prove that Skorzeny had ordered his men to commit war crimes. The evidence suggested that he had tried, however imperfectly, to operate within legal boundaries. In the end, Skorzeny was acquitted of the charges related to Operation Greif, though he was convicted on lesser counts related to his membership in the SS. He spent more than a year in detention before being released in 1948. In a final twist, befitting his reputation as a master of deception, Skorzeny later escaped Allied custody under murky circumstances. Some claimed he simply walked out of an internment camp in disguise and fled to Spain, where he lived for many years under the protection of Franco's regime. From there, Skorzeny reinvented himself as a kind of mercenary consultant and businessman, working with various governments and private clients across the world. He became a mythic figure in post-war Europe, his name whispered in connection with intelligence operations, secret armies, and even early plots to aid former Nazis in escaping Europe. Operation Greif, though militarily insignificant, had secured his place in history as the man who dared to fight a psychological war within a war. For historians, Operation Greif stands today as a revealing case study in the power and limits of deception. It demonstrated how fear and rumor could spread faster and farther than any armored column, shaping the behavior of armies and commanders alike. A few dozen men in stolen uniforms had managed to paralyze an entire command structure, if only temporarily. Their physical damage was minimal, their psychological impact immense. The operation also exposed a paradox at the heart of modern warfare, that in a conflict defined by vast industrial armies and mechanized destruction, the human mind remained the most vulnerable target of all. When soldiers could no longer trust appearances, when even the familiar insignia on a comrade's sleeve might conceal an enemy, the very fabric of military order began to fray. In the decades that followed, military planners around the world studied Operation Greif as both inspiration and warning. The techniques of deception, infiltration, and psychological warfare would evolve into new forms: special operations, misinformation campaigns, and covert missions that blurred the boundaries between soldier and spy. The uniforms changed, the technology advanced, but the essential lesson remained: confusion can be as deadly as firepower. By the time Otto Skorzeny died in 1975, the Cold War was in full swing, and intelligence agencies on both sides of the Iron Curtain routinely practiced the same arts of disguise, misdirection, and manipulation that he had pioneered in the Ardennes. The ghosts of Operation Greif lived on in the undercover agents of the CIA and KGB, in false flag operations across the globe, and in the recognition that warfare had entered a new, more psychological age. And yet, behind the intrigue and legend, there lingers a more human truth. The men who fought in the forests of Belgium, American and German alike, were trapped in a nightmare of uncertainty, where every shadow might conceal an enemy, and every friendly face could be a mask. In that frozen landscape, trust itself became a casualty of war. Operation Greif may have failed to alter the outcome of the Battle of the Bulge, but its legacy endures as a chilling reminder that in war, deception often cuts deeper than bullets. And sometimes, the deadliest weapon of all is doubt.